Dog goes to church every day at the same time, priest follows and is shocked. Father Michael stood frozen at the church's entrance, staring at the small brown dog sitting patiently by the heavy oak doors. The evening air was crisp, the setting sun casting long shadows across the courtyard, but the dog didn't move, its gaze fixed forward. This wasn't the first time Father Michael had seen the animal. For weeks, the creature had appeared at exactly 6 p.m., lingering silently before disappearing as quickly as it had come. The dog wasn't stray-like. Its coat was well kept, its posture calm, deliberate. But something about its routine gnawed at Father Michael. It wasn't normal, not in this quiet Pennsylvania town where life followed predictable patterns. Tonight, the priest felt an urgency he hadn't experienced before. He glanced at his watch. The bells for evening mass were moments away. Ignoring the puzzled glances from parishioners filing in, he stepped outside. "Hey buddy," he said softly, crouching slightly. The dog didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge his presence. Its eyes stayed locked on the door as if waiting for someone. Father Michael hesitated. Something about this felt deeply intentional. The dog shifted. A flicker of movement caught Father Michael's attention, and in an instant the animal bolted, not away from the church but toward the street. "Wait!" Father Michael called, instinctively following. The bells tolled behind him, signaling the start of Mass, but he didn't stop. The dog darted down a narrow alley, weaving through shadows. Father Michael's breath quickened as he struggled to keep pace. Finally, the dog stopped abruptly in front of a small, dilapidated house at the edge of town. Its tail wagged once, faintly, before it sat, gazing at the darkened doorway with the same intensity it had shown at the church. Father Michael approached cautiously. The house was quiet, too quiet. Its windows were dark, the front yard overgrown with weeds. He knocked on the door. No answer. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing into the silence. "Is anyone here?" A weak cough broke the stillness. Father Michael's heart raced as he heard the faint sound of shuffling feet. A figure emerged, a frail elderly man leaning heavily on the doorframe, his eyes sunken but kind. "What do you want?" the man croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. I followed your dog," Father Michael began, gesturing toward the animal now sitting calmly by the man's feet. The man frowned, confused. "My dog?" "Yes," the priest replied. "It's been coming to the church every evening. Always at 6. The man looked down at the dog, who now gazed up at him with an expression that seemed almost human. He shook his head. "Toby's not my dog. He just showed up one day and never left." Father Michael studied the man more closely. His clothes hung loosely on his frail frame, his breathing labored. The house smelled faintly of mildew and neglect. "Are you all right?" Father Michael asked, concern creeping into his voice. The man sighed. "I get by. Don't need much." But it was clear he did. The emptiness in his home mirrored something deeper, a loneliness that Father Michael could almost feel. "Maybe Toby came to find help," the priest said gently. The man's face softened, his eyes glistening. "Help?" he murmured, almost to himself. Father Michael glanced at Toby, who had settled at the man's feet, his tail wagging slightly. For the first time he understood. The dog wasn't waiting for someone at the church. He was sending a message. And Father Michael had heard it. Father Michael sat in the church office that night, staring at the clock on the wall. It was just past midnight, but sleep eluded him. The image of the old man, his gaunt face framed by the shadows of his crumbling house, wouldn't leave his mind. Neither would the dog, Toby. The connection between them was undeniable, but the man's words still echoed in his ears. "Toby's not my dog. He just showed up one day and never left." Who was Toby waiting for? And why the church? These questions had followed Father Michael back to the rectory, gnawing at his thoughts like an itch he couldn't scratch. The next evening, Father Michael stood by the church doors earlier than usual, scanning the street as the minutes ticked toward 6. Right on time, Toby appeared, trotting down the sidewalk with that same purposeful stride. He reached the doors and sat, his brown eyes fixed on the handle as though expecting it to open by itself. This time, Father Michael didn't hesitate. He stepped outside and sat on the steps, closer to the dog than before. "Toby," he said, testing the name aloud. The dog's ears twitched, but he didn't look at the priest. "Who are you waiting for, huh? Is it the old man? Or someone else?" Toby didn't answer, of course. He just stared at the door, unblinking, his body as still as a statue. Father Michael exhaled slowly and leaned back, resting his arms on his knees. "I met your friend," he continued, as though the dog might respond. "He doesn't seem well. Is that why you've been coming here? Trying to get someone to notice?" The silence stretched on, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the autumn breeze. And then, as if on cue, Toby stood, shook himself lightly, and started walking down the street again. Father Michael hesitated for only a moment before following. He knew where the dog was going this time, but that didn't make the journey any less strange. It felt almost ritualistic, this silent procession through the streets. When they reached the old man's house, the priest knocked on the door again. This time, the response came quicker, a shuffling of feet, followed by the creak of the door as it opened just wide enough for the man to peer out. "You're back," the old man said, his voice tinged with both surprise and weariness. "I wanted to check on you," Father Michael replied. He glanced down at Toby, who had taken his usual spot by the man's feet. "And him?" The old man opened the door wider, leaning on the frame for support. "Come in if you want. Not much to see though." Father Michael stepped inside, and the smell of damp wood and stale air hit him immediately. The living room was sparse, with only a battered armchair and a small table holding a few photographs. A faint layer of dust coated everything, a testament to how little the space was used. The old man lowered himself into the armchair with a groan, waving a hand toward a rickety dining chair nearby. "Sit if you want. Name's Walter, by the way." "Michael," the priest replied, sitting down cautiously. "Father Michael." Walter nodded faintly, his gaze dropping to Toby, who had curled up on the floor beside him. "Funny thing, that dog. Showed up a couple of months ago. Started following me around, then started heading to the church. I didn't ask him to, but he just does. He's loyal," Father Michael said, watching Toby's steady breathing. "Maybe he thinks you need someone to look out for you?" Walter chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Maybe. But what does a dog know about looking out for someone?" "Sometimes," Father Michael replied, "animals see things we don't. They have instincts. Maybe Toby's trying to tell you something, or tell us something." Walter didn't respond right away. He stared at the dog for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed. "I don't have much left for anyone to look after. My wife passed 5 years ago. No kids. No family close by. Just me in this old house. And Toby," Father Michael added gently. Walter's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "Yeah. And Toby?" The conversation lapsed into silence. Father Michael wanted to press further, to understand more about Walter's life and how he'd ended up so isolated. But something told him not to push too hard, not yet. "I'll come by again," he said eventually, rising from his chair. "If that's all right." Walter shrugged, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Relief, maybe, or gratitude. "Suit yourself." Father Michael smiled faintly. "Take care of yourself, Walter. And Toby?" As he stepped outside, the cool evening air hit him and he breathed deeply. He glanced back at the house one last time before heading back to the church. Toby's presence was no accident. Father Michael was certain of that now. But what exactly the dog was trying to tell him, and why, remained a mystery. For now. The next day dragged for Father Michael. The quiet of the church was nothing compared to the unsettling stillness that seemed to have settled around Walter's house. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that Toby wasn't just any stray. There was something profoundly intentional about his visits, and something equally intentional about the way he and Walter had found one another. As the clock neared 6 the following evening, Father Michael found himself at the church door once again, waiting. He had come to understand that this moment, the appearance of the dog, the stillness of it all, had become a part of his evening ritual. He wondered if it was the same for Toby. Exactly on time the dog appeared. He trotted down the same path, weaving between the same shadows, until he reached the church steps, sat down and fixed his gaze on the door. Father Michael stepped outside, this time without hesitation. There was no uncertainty now, no need for questioning. Something bigger than him had set this in motion, and he needed to follow it wherever it would lead. He sat beside Toby, watching the dog's calm demeanor as the minutes ticked by. The evening mass was nearing, but Father Michael felt no pull to hurry inside. Not this time. Toby shifted slightly, then rose, looking up at the priest with an almost knowing gaze. He turned and began walking toward the street. It wasn't the same path this time. Father Michael followed, and as they walked, the world seemed quieter, as though all the noise of the day had receded into the background. It was just him and Toby, a simple act of walking, yet the priest couldn't shake the feeling that he was being guided toward something important. When they arrived at Walter's house, the old man was already standing in the doorway, looking out as though he had been expecting them. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded slowly as Toby trotted to his feet and lay down beside him. Walter glanced at the priest, then back at the dog. "You've come again," Walter said quietly. "I have," Father Michael replied, his voice softer than usual. "And I'm not leaving this time without understanding why." Walter's tired eyes met his, searching for something behind Father Michael's words. He stepped aside, allowing the priest to enter without a word. The house still smelled the same, musty, worn down by time and neglect. But there was a noticeable difference now. The air wasn't as heavy, not as suffocating. It was as if the dog's presence and the priest's own had begun to bring some life into the space. Toby lay down without moving, his head resting on his paws, eyes closed in peaceful repose. Walter settled back into his chair, his movements slow, deliberate. "I don't know what you expect to find, Father," Walter said, his voice raspy but not unkind. "I'm just an old man with a dog who won't leave me alone." "It's not just that, Walter," Father Michael said, his gaze flickering toward the dog. "It's what Toby's doing. It's what you both are doing. There's a connection between you, something more than just companionship." Walter exhaled sharply, as though the weight of the words were too much to bear. He leaned back in the chair, his hand going to his forehead as if trying to ward off a headache. "He came to me when I was lost," Walter murmured. "I wasn't living, not really. I was just existing. But then he showed up and it was like I had someone again. Not a person, no. He's not that kind of companion. But he's here. And when he goes to the church, I feel like maybe there's something bigger than me in this world. Maybe something I can still believe in." Father Michael listened, his heart heavy with understanding. Walter had been left behind by life, by the death of his wife, by the absence of family. But Toby had found him, or perhaps Walter had found Toby. It wasn't clear who had rescued whom. But what was clear was that the bond between them was real, undeniable. Father Michael leaned forward, his voice more gentle now. "What if I told you that Toby's not just bringing you companionship? What if he's trying to show you something, guide you to something?" Walter gave him a skeptical look. "What are you talking about?" "I don't know yet," Father Michael admitted. "But I have a feeling that he's been leading me to you for a reason. I think you're both part of something, something I don't understand yet, but I'm starting to see." The silence between them deepened. Walter's eyes drifted to Toby, and for the first time Father Michael saw the man's face soften. The hardness that had been there, the walls built by years of grief and solitude, seemed to crack just a little. "Maybe," Walter said quietly. "Maybe there's still a reason for me to be here. Maybe I'm not done yet." Father Michael didn't answer right away. There was no need. The words had been spoken, and the truth between them hung in the air like a quiet prayer. He knew then that there was something happening here, something that could change not only Walter's life, but the life of the whole town. "I'll be here tomorrow," Father Michael said, standing up. Walter nodded without saying anything. The old man didn't need to. He understood now. As Father Michael stepped outside, Toby followed him, his tail wagging faintly, and for the first time the priest didn't feel the need to hurry. He lingered for a moment longer, taking in the calm of the evening. He knew that this wasn't the end of the story, far from it. There was something deeper at play, and he was determined to follow it wherever it might lead. The next few days passed in a blur for Father Michael. There were masses to conduct, confessions to hear, and the usual rhythms of parish life to maintain. But all of it felt secondary now, as if the pressing need to understand Walter and Toby had taken precedence over everything else. The mystery was unfolding slowly, piece by piece, and Father Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he was getting closer to something important. Each evening, Toby appeared at the church at precisely 6 o'clock. The dog had become a fixture in Father Michael's life, and his nightly walks to Walter's house had become routine. But there was still something unsettling in the quietness of the old man's home, a weight that Father Michael couldn't quite place. Despite the fleeting moments of connection, Walter remained an enigma, his past shrouded in silence. Tonight, Father Michael found himself walking the familiar path toward Walter's house again, this time with a sense of urgency in his step. The air had grown colder, a sharp reminder that the seasons were changing. He had a feeling that tonight something was going to shift, something in their conversation, in their understanding of one another. He could feel it in his bones. Toby led the way, his tail wagging slightly as he trotted ahead, as if he knew where he was going. Father Michael followed closely, the steady rhythm of his footsteps matching the dog's. When they reached the house, Walter was already waiting at the door. But this time something was different in his posture. There was no weariness in his eyes, no resignation. He looked ready, like he had been expecting Father Michael. "You're here," Walter said, but his tone wasn't one of surprise. It was almost as if he had been waiting for this moment too. "I'm here," Father Michael replied, stepping inside. This time there was no hesitation. He had been here enough to know what to expect. Nothing and everything all at once. Inside, the house felt warmer than usual despite the chill outside. Walter was sitting in his usual chair, but he had moved a few things around. A couple of photographs on the mantel, a half-empty glass of water on the table. He had made a conscious effort to clear the space as if preparing for a visitor. "Toby's been good to you, hasn't he?" Father Michael asked, sitting across from the old man. Toby, as always, was lying at Walter's feet, his eyes flicking between the two men. It was clear that this was his domain, that he had claimed Walter as his own, and Father Michael had begun to realize just how much the dog had become the anchor in the old man's life. "He's been more than good to me," Walter replied, his voice low but steady. "He saved me in a way. I don't know how else to put it." Father Michael listened intently, waiting for Walter to continue. It wasn't often that the old man spoke about his past, and when he did, it was always in cryptic fragments. Tonight, Father Michael felt like Walter was ready to open up, ready to share the truth that had been buried beneath years of grief and isolation. Walter paused, then spoke again, his words measured but heavy with emotion. "I lost my wife, Mary, 5 years ago. We were everything to each other. No kids, no family to speak of. It was just the two of us, and when she died it felt like the world just stopped. I couldn't see a way forward. I didn't want to." Father Michael nodded, his heart aching for the man. The grief that had defined Walter's life was clear now, the reason for his retreat into solitude. But something had shifted in him, something had drawn him back from the edge. And Father Michael now understood that Toby had played a crucial part in that. But then Toby showed up, Walter continued, his eyes drifting to the dog. "I don't know why. One day he just appeared in the yard. He was a stray, but there was something about him. He wasn't like the others. He kept coming back. Every day. I don't know what he was looking for, but after a while, I realized he was looking for me." Father Michael sat quietly, giving Walter the space he needed. The words were heavy, but they were real. The old man was beginning to confront the rawness of his emotions, and Toby was there, a silent witness to it all. "I wasn't living anymore," Walter said, his voice thick with regret. "I was just going through the motions. But Toby, he pulled me out of it. He would sit with me when I cried. He'd stay by my side when I didn't want to get out of bed. And when he started going to the church, I didn't understand it at first. But now," he trailed off, shaking his head. Father Michael leaned forward, sensing the weight of Walter's confession. "You think he's showing you something? Something more?" Walter met his gaze, his eyes clear and direct for the first time. "I think he's showing me that I'm not done yet. That there's still a purpose for me. Maybe I didn't need to have kids or a big family to feel like I matter. Maybe I just needed to believe that someone cared. And maybe Toby was the one who showed me that." The priest was silent for a moment, reflecting on Walter's words. There was a profound truth in them, a truth that transcended the ordinary and touched something deeper, something spiritual. It wasn't just the dog that had saved Walter, it was the connection, the bond that had formed between them, rooted in loyalty, presence, and unconditional care. "You're not alone, Walter," Father Michael said, his voice soft but firm. "You never were. And neither is Toby." The old man nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I think I've known that for a while now." Father Michael stood, placing a hand on Walter's shoulder. "I'll be here tomorrow and every day after that if you need me." Walter smiled, the first real smile Father Michael had seen from him. It was small, but it was there. And in that moment, Father Michael knew that the old man's journey of healing had only just begun. The days that followed felt different for both Father Michael and Walter. There was a subtle shift in the air, a quiet transformation that wasn't immediately visible but was deeply felt. Father Michael continued his nightly visits, and with each one the bond between him, Walter, and Toby deepened. It was as if the old man, who had been so shut off from the world, was slowly opening himself to the possibility of connection again. Father Michael had seen many people come and go through his years of service, those seeking redemption, comfort, or just an ear to listen. But Walter was different. His pain, though buried for years, was raw and real. And now, the priest had come to understand that Toby wasn't just the messenger. He was the catalyst. The dog had come into Walter's life at a time when the man had given up, offering him the thing he hadn't known he needed, the willingness to believe that he was still worthy of love and purpose. That evening, as Father Michael made his way toward the small house on the outskirts of town, he felt a strange heaviness in his chest. There had been a tension in the air these past few days, a quiet unease that had crept in unnoticed, like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something told him that tonight would be different. Toby was already waiting by the door when Father Michael arrived, as if the dog had known he would be there. The moment the priest stepped onto the porch, Toby padded over to him, offering his usual greeting with a wag of his tail. But there was something in the dog's eyes, a sadness, almost, something that made Father Michael pause. "I've come again," Father Michael said gently, crouching down to meet the dog's gaze. Toby's eyes softened, and for a moment, it felt as if the dog understood more than words could express. He turned and padded into the house, leading the way. Inside, the air felt thicker than usual. Walter was sitting in his chair, but his posture was different. The old man's face was drawn, his hands resting tightly on the arms of the chair, his eyes fixed on the floor as though he were lost in thought. Toby had already curled up by his feet, but there was an uncomfortable stillness in the room, as if something unspoken hung between them. "You're here," Walter said quietly, not looking up. "I'm here," Father Michael replied, his voice steady but filled with concern. He walked over to the chair and sat across from the old man, his eyes searching Walter's face for any signs of what had shifted. There was something heavy in the air, something that spoke of unspoken fears and anxieties. "I don't know what to do anymore," Walter muttered, finally meeting Father Michael's gaze. I thought Toby was the answer. That he'd be enough to pull me out of this hole I've been in. But," his voice faltered. "But I'm still stuck, Father. I'm still so alone." Father Michael didn't respond right away. He let the silence sit between them, the weight of Walter's words hanging in the air. He knew that Walter was struggling, that the darkness that had taken root in his heart was not easily dispelled. But there was something else in the man's voice, something that told him the old man was reaching the end of his rope. "You're not alone, Walter," Father Michael said, his voice calm but firm. "Not anymore." Walter shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "You don't understand. I've been alone for so long. And Toby can't fix that. He's a dog. He doesn't know how to fill the hole in me." Father Michael's heart ached as he looked at the old man. The grief that had consumed him for so long was still there, buried deep, but it wasn't just the loss of his wife or the years of solitude that weighed him down. It was the fear that no matter what he did, no matter how hard he tried, he would never be enough to heal the wounds inside of him. "Sometimes, Walter," Father Michael said softly, "we don't heal all at once. Sometimes healing is a slow process. It doesn't happen in the way we think it should, and it doesn't happen overnight." Walter's gaze dropped to his hands, the weight of his sorrow pulling his shoulders down. "I don't know how much longer I can keep going like this." Father Michael felt the heaviness in the room like a physical presence, as though the walls were closing in. He wanted to reach out, to offer something. Some solution, some magic words that would take the pain away. But there were no easy answers. "What if healing isn't about being whole?" Father Michael asked, his voice thoughtful. "What if it's about finding peace with the broken parts of ourselves?" Walter looked up, his eyes wary. "Peace? With what's broken?" "Yes," Father Michael said, nodding. "The brokenness, the pain, it's a part of you. But it doesn't define you. And it doesn't have to be the end of your story." Toby lifted his head from his paws, sensing the shift in the conversation. His eyes met Walter's, a silent presence that seemed to communicate something that words could not. And for a moment, in the stillness of the room, Father Michael could see it. The deep, unspoken connection between the old man and the dog. Toby had become more than just a companion. He had become a reminder that even in the midst of grief, there was still something worth living for. Walter stared at Toby for a long time, his eyes softening as he took in the dog's steady gaze. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, his shoulders relaxed. The tension that had held him captive seemed to ease, if only for a moment. "You're right," Walter said, his voice quieter now. "Maybe I don't need to be whole. Maybe I just need to keep going. One day at a time." Father Michael smiled, feeling a glimmer of hope that had been absent from Walter's heart for so long. "That's all any of us can do, Walter. Just take it one step at a time." The room was silent for a long while, but it was a different kind of silence now, one filled with a quiet understanding. Walter wasn't healed, not yet. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone in his brokenness. And for Father Michael, that was enough. Days blurred into nights as Father Michael continued his visits to Walter's house, and with each passing day, something subtle yet undeniable was shifting. Walter, though far from healed, had begun to show signs of life that Father Michael hadn't seen before. There were moments, small moments but still significant, when the old man would laugh or share a memory of his wife Mary, or even express a fleeting hope for the future. And with every shift in Walter, Toby was there, his steady presence a silent, grounding force in the room. But as the days wore on, the priest could sense the tension in the air. Something was still unresolved, something in Walter's heart that hadn't yet found peace. There were evenings when the old man would sit for hours in his chair, his eyes fixed on the floor, as though the weight of his memories pressed down on him more heavily than before. Tonight, Father Michael arrived at the house with an unsettling feeling in the pit of his stomach. The usual calm that greeted him at the door was absent. The moment he stepped onto the porch, he could feel it, a heaviness in the air, a subtle shift that told him something was wrong. Toby was sitting by the door as always, but the dog didn't rise to greet him. Instead, he stared up at Father Michael with a look in his eyes that the priest couldn't quite place. It wasn't fear, but it wasn't calm either. It was a look that said something was out of balance, something had changed. Father Michael knocked softly, then entered the house without waiting for a response. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with silence. Walter was in his chair, but his face was drawn, his eyes hollow in a way Father Michael had never seen before. Toby stood by his feet, his tail still, his body rigid, as though he too sensed the disturbance in the room. "Walter?" Father Michael's voice was cautious, his heart heavy with concern. Walter didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the floor, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. It was as though he were holding himself together, bracing for something Father Michael couldn't yet understand. "I've been thinking," Walter began, his voice low and strained. "About what you said the other night. About peace with the broken parts of me." Father Michael nodded, sitting across from him. "What about it?" "I don't think I can do it," Walter said, his words heavy with resignation. "I've tried, Father. I've tried to find peace, but every time I think I'm making progress, it all just comes crashing down again. I don't know how to keep living like this." The pain in Walter's voice was palpable, and Father Michael could feel the weight of it press in on him. It was as if the old man had reached a breaking point, a moment where the grief that had been buried for so long could no longer be contained. "You don't have to do it alone," Father Michael said gently. "You have Toby. And you have me. We'll walk this path together, one day at a time." Walter shook his head, his voice trembling as he spoke. "It's not enough, Father. It's never enough. Toby's been here, he's been with me through all of this, but he can't fill the emptiness I feel. He's just a dog. He can't fix what's broken in me." Father Michael sat in silence, watching Walter, searching for the right words to reach him. He could see the deep despair in the old man's eyes, but he also saw something else, a flicker of something deeper, a longing for healing that was buried beneath the layers of pain. "You're right," Father Michael said after a moment, his voice steady but compassionate. "Toby can't fix what's broken in you. But he's not here to fix you. He's here to be with you. And that's enough. Sometimes the healing doesn't come in the way we expect. Sometimes it comes in the small, quiet moments, the moments where we allow ourselves to simply be. You're not broken, Walter. You're hurting. And hurting doesn't make you any less worthy of love, of peace." Toby moved toward Walter, nuzzling his hand with a gentle nudge, as if sensing the moment needed his quiet support. Walter looked down at the dog, and for the first time in days, his face softened. His hand slowly reached down to scratch behind Toby's ears, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but one that spoke volumes. "I don't know if I can do this," Walter murmured. "I don't know if I can ever find peace again." "You don't have to have it all figured out," Father Michael replied, his voice gentle. "You just have to keep trying. One day at a time. And if you stumble, if you fall, Toby will be there. And I will too. We'll keep going together." For a long moment Walter said nothing. He didn't have to. His hand was still on Toby's head, and the connection between the old man and the dog was undeniable. There was something so simple, yet so profound in that quiet moment of shared presence. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't a miracle. But it was enough. Father Michael stood, feeling a sense of peace settle over him despite the weight of the conversation. "I'll be here tomorrow, Walter. Every day if you need me." Walter didn't respond, but his eyes, though still clouded with sorrow, held something else now. A glimmer of hope, small but steady, like a flame flickering in the dark. As Father Michael left the house that night, he couldn't help but feel that, though the road ahead would be difficult, something had shifted. Walter wasn't healed, not yet, but he was starting to find his way. And for Father Michael that was enough. The journey was far from over, but perhaps, just perhaps, they were closer to the light than they had been before. Weeks passed, and with each visit, Father Michael could see a subtle change in Walter. It wasn't a sudden shift, no grand transformation, but it was there. The old man's shoulders, once slumped with the weight of years of grief, were now standing a little straighter. His eyes, though still touched with sadness, had a steadier, more focused look about them. There was less hesitation in his voice, less distance between him and the world around him. But though there were signs of progress, Father Michael knew that Walter wasn't fully at peace. There were still moments when the weight of the past seemed to overwhelm him, when the grief of losing his wife and the years of solitude would creep back in, pulling him into a darkness he couldn't escape. And those were the times when Toby became his anchor, the dog's silent presence reminding Walter that he wasn't alone in his pain. Tonight, Father Michael arrived at Walter's house just as the sun was beginning to set. The air had grown cooler, the sharpness of winter beginning to edge its way into the evening. As always, Toby was waiting by the door, his tail wagging as he greeted the priest. But tonight, there was something different in the dog's demeanor, something that made Father Michael pause. Toby stood still, his eyes locked on Father Michael, a silent tension in the air that he couldn't quite place. The dog didn't move toward him as usual. Instead, he seemed to be waiting, watching. Father Michael knelt down, his voice soft. "What is it, boy?" Toby whined quietly but didn't move. There was an unfamiliar anxiety in the dog's eyes, a sense of unease that Father Michael couldn't ignore. He felt a sudden wave of concern. "Walter?" he called softly as he pushed the door open. Inside, the house was dimly lit, the flickering light from a single lamp casting long shadows against the walls. Walter was sitting in his usual chair, but tonight, there was an unsettling stillness in the room. The air felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension that Father Michael couldn't understand. "Walter?" he called again, stepping further inside. For a long moment there was no response. Then, slowly, Walter lifted his head, his eyes meeting Father Michael's with a weariness that seemed to come from deep within. It wasn't the usual weariness of a man who had lived a long life, it was the weariness of someone who had been fighting something, someone who had been carrying a burden for so long that they weren't sure they could carry it anymore. "I can't do it," Walter said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words were raw, a confession that had been building for weeks. "I can't keep pretending that I'm okay. I'm not okay, Father. I'm not sure I'll ever be." Father Michael took a step forward, his heart heavy with empathy. He could see it now, the crack in Walter's armor, the rawness that had been buried beneath the surface all this time. The old man was breaking, not in a way that was dramatic or violent, but in a quiet, devastating way. "You don't have to pretend, Walter," Father Michael said gently, his voice calm but firm. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore." Toby, who had remained by the door, now trotted over to Walter's side. The dog placed his head in the old man's lap, his presence a quiet reassurance. Walter's hand moved instinctively to scratch behind Toby's ears, the familiar gesture grounding him, even if only for a moment. "I thought if I could just keep going, if I could just keep living, I'd find a way through it," Walter continued, his voice shaking now. "But it's not working. The pain, the loneliness, it doesn't go away. And I feel like I'm losing Toby too. He's been my only friend, my only companion. And now," he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Father Michael felt the depth of Walter's fear. It wasn't just the pain of losing his wife. It was the fear that he would lose Toby too, the one constant in his life. The fear that, no matter how much he tried to move forward, he would always be left with the same emptiness, the same loneliness. "You're not going to lose Toby, Walter," Father Michael said quietly, his voice steady. "He's here for you. And you're not going to lose me either. You don't have to carry this burden by yourself." Walter's eyes filled with tears, his grip tightening on Toby's fur as he struggled to hold back the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "But I don't know how to let go of it, Father. I don't know how to stop carrying the past. It's all I have left." Father Michael's heart ached for the old man. He knew that Walter wasn't asking for a quick fix. He wasn't asking for a miracle. What he was asking for, in this quiet, heartbreaking moment, was the courage to let go, to release the weight of his grief and the fear that had defined him for so long. "You don't have to let go of everything all at once," Father Michael said, his voice gentle but firm. "Healing is a slow process. It's not about forgetting the past, Walter. It's about learning how to live with it. It's about finding a way to carry the memories of your wife, of your life, without letting them define you. You're not broken. You're just healing." Walter looked up at him, his expression torn. "But how? How do I start?" Father Michael sat down beside him, his hand resting on Walter's shoulder. "You start by accepting that it's okay to hurt. It's okay to feel the weight of what you've lost. But you don't have to carry it alone. You have Toby. You have me. And together we'll take this one step at a time." Walter nodded slowly as though the words were sinking in, though the pain was still there, still sharp and raw. But something in his eyes had softened. The look of resignation had faded, replaced by a small, tentative flicker of hope. Toby shifted in his lap, looking up at Walter with those steady, trusting eyes. And for the first time in a long time, Walter allowed himself to believe, just for a moment, that he wasn't alone. He wasn't broken. He was just still learning how to heal. Father Michael stood, his hand lingering on Walter's shoulder. "I'll be here, Walter. Every day. One step at a time." The old man didn't respond, but as Father Michael left the house that night, he saw something in Walter's eyes that hadn't been there before. A glimmer of something like peace. And for Father Michael, that was enough to carry him through another day. The cold air had begun to bite with more force as winter took hold, but tonight, Father Michael felt a warmth in his chest that had been absent for a long time. It wasn't a dramatic shift or a sudden epiphany, but it was something real. Walter had shown a small crack in his armor, a willingness to let someone in, to begin the slow, painful process of healing. And that, in itself, felt like a victory. For weeks, the priest had watched Walter struggle with his grief, his fear, and the deep sense of loss that weighed him down. But now, as Father Michael stood outside the small house, waiting for the usual greeting from Toby, he could feel that things were changing. The air felt a little lighter tonight, as if there had been some shift in the fragile balance that held the old man together. When the door opened, it wasn't Toby who greeted him first, it was Walter. His face, though still marked by the passage of time and sorrow, seemed softer. The hard edge that had once clouded his eyes had faded, replaced by something more open, something vulnerable. "Father," Walter said, his voice steady but quieter than usual. "I've been thinking about what you said. About healing and about carrying the past." Father Michael smiled gently. "I'm glad to hear that." Walter nodded and stepped aside to let the priest in. As Father Michael entered, he noticed the shift in the atmosphere. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but there was a lightness in the air, a stillness that felt less heavy than before. The silence in the room wasn't oppressive, it felt peaceful, like the calm after a storm. Toby, as always, was by Walter's side, but tonight he seemed more relaxed, his tail wagging gently as the priest knelt down to give him a quick scratch behind the ears. The dog's presence was a constant reminder of the journey they had all been on, how far they had come, how far they still had to go. "Sit with me," Walter said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "I want to talk." Father Michael sat, his heart full of quiet hope. He had seen so many people struggle, wrestle with their demons, and try to outrun their pain. But Walter was different. He wasn't pretending anymore. He was allowing himself to be vulnerable, to acknowledge the broken parts of himself without fear of judgment or rejection. "Something's changed," Walter continued, his voice low. "I don't know exactly what it is, but I think I'm starting to believe that maybe I can heal. Maybe I can find a way through this." Father Michael felt a wave of emotion wash over him, pride, relief, and something like awe. This wasn't a sudden transformation, but a gradual unfolding, like a flower blooming slowly in the harsh winter. "You've been through so much, Walter," Father Michael said quietly. "It's not going to be easy. But the fact that you're willing to take that first step, just that, means more than you know." Walter nodded, his gaze distant for a moment as though he were lost in his thoughts. He looked down at Toby, who was lying contentedly at his feet, and then back up at the priest. "I've spent so long thinking that the past was something I couldn't move past. I thought it was something that would define me forever. But maybe that's not true." Father Michael remained silent, allowing Walter to continue at his own pace. He knew that this moment, this realization, was something Walter needed to discover for himself. It wasn't about preaching or giving advice. It was about letting the old man find his way, step by step, through the fog of his grief. "I've been holding on to the memory of Mary," Walter said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been holding on to her so tightly as if by keeping her alive in my mind, I could somehow undo the pain of losing her. But," his voice faltered for a moment, then steadied. "But I think I'm ready to let go of the way I've been holding on to her. I think I'm ready to remember her the way she would have wanted me to, without the weight of my grief weighing me down." Father Michael's heart swelled as he listened to Walter's words. He had been right all along. Healing wasn't about forgetting the past or pretending the pain didn't exist, it was about learning to live with it, to carry it without letting it consume you. "Mary would be proud of you," Father Michael said softly. "She would be proud of how far you've come, and how much you've fought to keep moving forward. And I know that she would want you to find peace, Walter. She would want you to be happy again." Tears welled up in Walter's eyes, but they weren't the tears of despair that had come so many times before. These were different, more like the release of a dam breaking after years of holding back. He reached for Toby, his hand shaking slightly, and the dog responded instantly, nuzzling his face into the old man's hand as if to say, "I'm here. You're not alone." "I don't know what the future holds, Father," Walter said, his voice raw but filled with a quiet strength. "But I think I'm ready to find out." Father Michael smiled, his heart filled with hope. "That's all any of us can do, Walter. Just take it one day at a time. And remember, you're not alone. You have Toby. And you have me. We're in this together." For the first time in a long time, Walter allowed himself to believe in the possibility of a future that wasn't defined by loss. He wasn't healed, not yet, but he had taken a step forward. And sometimes that was all it took. As Father Michael left the house that night, he knew that the road ahead would still be difficult. But for the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace settle in his heart. Walter had opened up, had allowed himself to take a step toward healing. And that, in itself, was a miracle. Tomorrow they would take another step. And the day after that, another. But tonight, Father Michael allowed himself to feel the quiet joy of knowing that the journey was no longer one of isolation. It was one of connection, of shared healing, and of love, both given and received. And that, he knew, was the beginning of something beautiful. The snow had begun to fall heavily, covering the earth in a soft, white blanket as Father Michael made his way to Walter's house. It was a late afternoon, the light from the setting sun casting long shadows across the yard, and there was a stillness in the air that seemed to speak of change. He had visited Walter countless times over the past months, each visit slowly chipping away at the wall of grief that the old man had built around himself. And now, tonight, there was something different. Something he could not quite put into words, but which he felt deeply in his chest. Walter had been quieter than usual during their past few encounters, but Father Michael had noticed a shift, a growing openness, a willingness to confront the ghost that had haunted him for so long. And though the old man still struggled, though the pain was still there, it was as if he was beginning to learn how to live with it, how to make space for joy even in the midst of sorrow. As Father Michael stepped onto the porch, Toby was waiting as always. But tonight, the dog seemed unusually calm, his tail wagging slowly but not in the frantic way it had in the past. There was a quiet strength in the way Toby stood there, watching the priest with clear, intelligent eyes. The dog had always been the steady presence in Walter's life, but tonight, Toby seemed to be mirroring the peace that was beginning to settle in the old man's heart. Father Michael knocked gently, his hand lingering on the door before he pushed it open. Inside, the room was warm and cozy, the smell of something homemade filling the air. Walter was sitting in his chair, his eyes not as hollow as they once were, his expression more at ease than Father Michael had seen in a long time. He looked up when the priest entered, a faint but genuine smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Father," Walter greeted him, his voice softer than usual, yet full of warmth. "Come in. I've been expecting you." Father Michael stepped inside, his heart lifting at the sight of the old man's smile. It wasn't a perfect smile and it wasn't one free of sorrow, but it was real. It was the kind of smile that came from a place of acceptance, from a willingness to embrace life, even in all its imperfections. "I'm glad to see you, Walter," Father Michael said, settling into the chair across from him. Toby, as usual, padded over to his side and sat down beside him, resting his head on the priest's lap as though he too recognized that something had shifted. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other day," Walter began, his voice steady. "About healing not meaning forgetting. About carrying the past without letting it define me. I don't know if I believe it all the way yet, but..." He paused as if searching for the right words. "But I think I'm starting to understand." Father Michael nodded, his heart full. "It's not something that happens overnight. It's a slow process, a journey. But the fact that you're even open to it, that's a big step." Walter looked down at Toby, his hand moving absent-mindedly through the dog's fur. "I don't know what I'd do without him. Toby's been my constant, my reason to get up in the mornings. He's the only one who's never left me, never judged me." Father Michael watched the way Walter's hand moved so gently over the dog's back, as though the simple act of touching Toby grounded him. It was a reminder that the love between them, this unspoken bond, had been a lifeline for Walter, one that had kept him tethered to the world even when it felt like everything else was slipping away. "You're not alone, Walter," Father Michael said, his voice steady. "You have Toby, yes, but you also have a community here. People who care about you. People who want to see you heal." Walter's gaze softened, and for the first time in a long time, the weight of the past seemed to lift, if only for a moment. I think I've been so focused on what I've lost that I forgot to see what I still have, he admitted quietly. I've been so wrapped up in my pain that I didn't realize how much love was still here. Father Michael smiled, his heart swelling with pride. It's easy to get lost in grief, Walter. It's all-consuming. But there's always more than just the pain. There's always something else, something worth living for. For a long while, the room was quiet, the only sound the gentle crackling of the fire in the hearth and the soft breathing of Toby, who had settled at Father Michael's feet. The peace that filled the room was palpable, as though the silence itself had become a form of healing. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from an absence of pain, it was the kind of peace that came from accepting the pain, from living alongside it and still choosing to move forward. I've been thinking a lot about Mary too, Walter said, his voice quiet but filled with tenderness. I've been thinking about how she would have wanted me to live. She wouldn't have wanted me to wallow in this grief forever. She would have wanted me to find a way to live again. Father Michael listened, sensing that this was a breakthrough of sorts, a turning point in Walter's healing process. The old man wasn't just accepting that he had to live with his grief, he was beginning to find a way to live beyond it, to honor the past without letting it control him. You're doing that now, Walter, Father Michael said softly. You're choosing to live. That's what she would have wanted. Walter's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but this time they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of release, of acceptance. I'm not all the way there yet, he said, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. But I'm trying. I really am. I know you are, Father Michael replied. And that's enough. They sat in silence for a long while after that, the bond between them unspoken but strong. Father Michael could feel the change in the air. It was quiet, subtle, but unmistakable. Walter wasn't fixed, he wasn't healed in the way that people often expect, but he was on his way. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem so daunting. It seemed possible. As the evening drew to a close, Father Michael stood and put his coat on, ready to leave for the night. He turned to Walter, who was still sitting quietly in his chair, Toby at his feet. I'll see you tomorrow, Walter. One step at a time. Walter nodded, a small smile on his face. One step at a time. And as Father Michael stepped out into the cold, snowy night, he felt something that had been missing for so long: hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that promised everything would be easy or that the past would simply fade away. It was the kind of hope that grew slowly, like a seed planted in the soil, nurtured by patience and care. Tomorrow would come, and they would take another step together. And that, Father Michael knew, was enough. As Father Michael stepped into the snow, the world around him was quiet, but inside, something had shifted. In Walter's heart, a tiny spark of hope had begun to glow, not because the pain was gone, but because he had chosen to face it step by step. Sometimes healing isn't a miracle that happens overnight, it's the courage to move forward, even when the past weighs heavily. And that, dear friends, is what makes all the difference. Have you ever felt like the weight of your past was too much to carry? What if I told you that healing starts with one simple step, just like Walter? If this story touched you, if you felt the strength in Walter's journey, then don't keep this to yourself. Share this message of hope. Like, comment, and share it with those who might need to hear it. And if you want more stories that show the power of compassion, of moving forward in the face of pain, don't forget to subscribe. You never know, your share might be the spark someone else needs to take their first step toward healing.